Hello and welcome to Ignore the Bell. I'm Nathan,
And I'm Tyler.
and today we are talking about what Tyler considers to be his absolute favorite movie trilogy, right?
Possibly
Possibly,
my
possibly.
favorite.
Back to the Future. All three Back to the Future films. So Back to the Future 1, 2, and 3.
hmm
Uh, and so we do have a sponsor for today's episode. At least I know I've been approached by a sponsor. I don't know if you've been approached by a sponsor.
No. I heard that you had a sponsor, and yeah, I'm excited to hear who it is.
Okay, great. So our sponsor for today's episode is Manure. Cheaper and smellier than airbags when you're going too fast and you need to slow down. Manure, buy it today.
Yes, absolutely. A cheap alternative to airbags. That's
That's right. A cheaper and smellier alternative. Let's
yes.
just lean into that. That's yeah.
It's
All
all
right, folks.
natural.
Yeah, it's all natural. Exactly. Probably doesn't cost as much to repair your car after, you deploy the manure instead of deploying airbags.
Might cost a little bit more to get the smell out, but
There's that. There's that. All right, folks, enjoy.
Oh man, I wish this discussion could go on forever.
Ignore the bell. We're gonna keep going, people.
All right, Back to the Future films. So they are all written and directed by Robert Zemeckis, and they were co-written with his writing partner Bob Gale. I've looked this up. So
okay. Yeah.
that I believe they wrote all three of them together. So Back to the Future came out in 1985, Back to the Future Part 2 came out in 1989, and then Back to the Future Part 3 came out in 1990.
hmm
These films um, are, it's so fun to kind of see this happen within our lifetime, that these are classic films that we actually got to experience at a fairly young age. Because you hear
Yes.
about classic films, from like the 30s or 40s or 50s or 60s, even the 70s, and you always feel a little separated from them. Like you weren't really part of that moment. Uh,
Yeah. I mean,
and I
I mean,
know
I was
for
not born.
you, yeah, well, I mean, like I wasn't. It's not like I was going to the movie theater to see these, but I do
Right.
remember seeing them in the early '90s when they were still, um, you know, pretty culturally relevant. But the interesting thing is that they've remained that way ever since they
Absolutely.
came out. And I think part of that, and this is kind of jumping ahead, I think a little bit in the discussion, but part of that has to do with the fact that they came out in the age of home videos, like home video cassettes, whether you're
Mhm.
talking about VHS or Betamax. And because starting in the mid 80s and then getting into the early 90s, more and more people were able to catch up on a series like this. Like before they go and see
Right.
Back to the Future Part 2 or Back to the Future Part 3, a making a film franchise became possible in the age of home video cassettes in the way that it
Yeah.
wasn't really possible before. Like if you did not go and see Star Wars in 77, if you didn't see A New Hope, it'd be pretty hard to, like, you'd have to have your friends give you this plot summary in order to get you caught up to be ready for Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean that takes on, a whole different feel today where instead of, oh, here, let me loan you my VHS, then it's on Netflix, so you should go watch that before we go to see the sequel. Um,
Exactly. That exactly. That's what I'm saying is now it's even easier
yeah,
to get caught up. That's I think part of what makes Hollywood, like it explains why Hollywood is doing what it's doing today with all these franchises, is that franchises dependent on people going to the theater when it initially got released, seeing the first one, and then you're having to wait until the next one comes out. And so you can easily forget what's come before.
yeah, no, absolutely. And that's why I think like a lot of you know, you occasionally see a sequel that does like a little bit of a recap of what happened in the first one at the beginning of the second one, or it's so different from the
Yeah.
original that you don't need to have seen the first one. Like if you didn't see the first Rocky, for example, then you're not losing all that much when you go to
No,
see Rocky 2.
you're right. You're right.
It's just like, oh yeah, this is another movie. And
Exactly. And that's what
yeah.
I'm saying is that I know that television has changed substantially and we've really like noticed it. And because we're living in the age of the internet, and so many people have written articles about this, about how in the age of streaming services, and even before that, being able to PVR your
Mhm.
TV shows, that it allows for binge watching of things.
Yeah.
um, and that's changed the way television works. That if you look at series that came out before binge watching was a thing, then they don't really hold up when you're binge watching. There's a lot of them
Yeah.
that just don't, that they're painful to try to watch one after the other after the other. You're like, oh man, I never knew this when I was watching it on TV when there's a week separating each episode. But boy, is this repetitive.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, especially one thing that we don't get anymore, like virtually at all, is previously on whatever
Right.
the show name is. You don't see that anymore because it's expected that you have somehow managed to watch the previous episode, whether that's, because you're binge watching it on a streaming service, or if, streamed it somewhere else in the week before the next episode came out.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, but I mean, even traditional network television is facilitating this by having episodes go onto their own websites where,
yeah, that's true.
like,
Yeah,
so you don't even have to do it illegally. There's actually like multiple avenues to be able to do that. Um,
that's true.
and
Yeah,
even on Netflix, there's been a few shows that I've watched where they do have a previously on, and Netflix automatically skips it. That you
yeah,
have to like manually go back and say, no, 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 I want that. But I think especially like I don't know how intuitive it is on Netflix if it is saying you just watched the last episode, therefore we're going to skip this. But if it's been like 6 months since you watched that last episode, are they still going to show you the previously on? I don't know.
yeah. That is kind of interesting. Anyway,
Yeah, so what I'm saying is with Back to the Future, then like I think you're seeing this with film. You're seeing
yes.
the first, not necessarily the very first, but you're seeing this early wave of films that are benefiting from home video cassette technology.
Yeah, I mean, there are in addition to people just, knowing the story that came before, you catch all these little details that are
Yes,
sprinkled throughout
that's what I'm
that,
saying.
yeah, that you don't get otherwise. Like if you had only seen each film once, there's no way that you would catch anywhere, like you wouldn't even catch close to half of the things in there.
Right.
Um, that tie over between them. And I mean, that's certainly the case when you're looking at Back to the Future Part Two, when Marty goes back to 1955, so the same time period as in the first film, and then you have two Martys running around, and you're seeing like
Yeah.
the same scenes from different angles and everything, and it's kind of fun to see it that way. So there are those things, but even some of the references that carry over between the three films, like or whether that's Buford Tannen or Biff
Right.
Tannen or Griff Tannen, I think is
I
the
can't
son's name.
remember.
But yeah, no, there were so many fun things to pick out between the films that just they work together very, very well, and it was obviously very well thought out, very well planned. I mean, they didn't really, as far as I know, they didn't really plan on doing a sequel,
Yeah, I don't think so.
part two. I think they had just done that little teaser at the end just to be like, oh yeah, and they're going to go on more adventures without
Right.
any solid plans. But then
Yeah.
they, had the idea for the second one, and then they shot part two and part three back to back. Um,
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, which is honestly, I think, probably one of the earliest examples of, sequels being shot back to back.
Right.
And they even had a teaser for part three featured at the end of part two. Uh, like a little bit of a trailer to say, oh yeah, look, here's what's going to
Yes.
happen when
Yeah.
they,
I
go
do.
back to the
Yeah. So part of the reason why I'm bringing up I mean, I think it's really significant to point to the fact that the films were benefiting from this early wave of VHS and Betamax technology. It's
old.
that's how I saw them. And so I remember that this is, I don't know, it legitimately might have been before you were even born that we did this. Like it might have been like 91 or something like that.
Right.
That because I'm trying to when did the third one come out?
I think he said 1990. Um,
Yeah, so legitimately, like it might have been 1990 on Saturday nights. Then we would have like a family movie night, and we did that
mm.
pretty regularly. So the
I
way
mean,
it
I,
worked,
I remember the family movie nights, going to Rogers Video or Jumbo Video, and getting something. But I specifically remember, Gumby and such. But
right? But this is actually before it became, as best I remember, before it even became a jumbo video. Then it was
okay.
a much smaller video shop across the street from us in the plaza.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, it was across
Wow.
the street from us in the plaza, and there was this video rental store, and we didn't own a VCR, and so they rented out VCRs to people. And so
Oh,
that's what
wow.
we did. We had to put down, it was like a ridiculous deposit. As best I remember, it was like $100. And
Oh
so
my
like you get
goodness.
it back, but it was like whether we could watch a movie depended on whether our parents had enough money to be able to put down the deposit. And I remember they put it in like a case that was basically like what they deliver hot pizzas in. It was like a padded thing with a fold over flap. And then like we had to carry it back across the street, you know? And so like dad's carrying this like VHS player that we borrowed for the night. Like if you wanted to pay more, you could have rented, as best I remember, you could have rented the Betamax version, right? But we got the VHS, and then we got the VHS tape. So you had to make sure that you're getting the right one, that you got the VHS cassette for the right player that you just like rented. And so you'd have to pay the rental fee for that. And then we watched the first Saturday, then we watched Back to the Future. And then as best I remember, the next Saturday we watched Back to the Future 2. And then the next Saturday we watched Back to the Future 3.
Oh,
And
that's awesome.
I was so blown away. I was like, there's a Back to the Future 2 and we get to watch it next week. And then it's like, there's a Back to the Future 3 and we get to watch it next week. Yeah, that was my first experience with it. I was the perfect age to watch those and enjoy them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the first time I watched them was probably on like TBS or whatever. So it was just
Yeah.
on TV. And I'm sure that I had seen the first Back to the Future a few times, more than once
Hmm.
before I even really knew that there was a part two and part three. Part one is very popular for network television to air, and two and three aren't as popular.
Yeah.
Uh, which makes sense because it's the same kind of thing where it's like, well, the first one is obviously going to be the one that is a better jumping off point
Yeah. It's the most
for people.
accessible for the
Yeah,
average person. Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, when I watched, you know, part two and part three, like my goodness, it's the whole trilogy is absolutely incredible. But part two and part three are so good. Like there are these tropes that are set in place in the first film that are then picked up in part two, in part three, and it doesn't feel like, you know, it doesn't really feel like they're trying to be like, oh yeah, like they're intentional callbacks. It's not
Yes.
it's not like, oh, we're telling the same story again and we're going to pretend like it's a completely different story. No, it's very much a continuation as much as it's a return to
Yes.
what the originals, what the previous ones were. Uh, and that's part of why, this trilogy is held in such high regard to me. I mean, it works so well as a
It
trilogy.
it really does, and I'm really interested in this. And so I do want to actually get into that in a fair bit of detail, but I want to kind of start somewhere else. So
Sure.
ultimately where I want to go with that is they do work so well, and I really want to examine why. Because I
Mm.
really do think on the surface, these films shouldn't work, but they really do. And so anyway, we'll get to that. But I don't know if you have. So this is what I want to do. I want to talk a little bit about the development of it first, because just a
Sure.
little bit of
Yeah.
reading that I've done on this is really interesting to me. Um, I don't know if you've seen John Mulaney. He's a stand-up comedian. He used to write for Saturday Night Live. Have you
Yeah, I've
seen
seen
his
him a few
bit?
times.
Okay, have you
Oh,
seen his
yes, I
bit?
have.
It's
I,
like a pitch meeting, right? Like he does this
yes.
amazing bit. I think that this is maybe before pitch meetings from whatever that YouTube
From
channel is.
Screen Rant. Yeah.
Screen Rant. Yeah. That I wonder if that's kind of where he got the idea, because for anybody who has not seen this, John Mulaney, I can't remember which comedy special it is, but he's got two or three. I want to say it's maybe in The Comeback Kid, in that one. But
Okay.
they're on Netflix.
I mean,
And he
I saw him do that segment on Just for Laughs. But
mm,
yeah, I'm sure that he's returned to it, a number of times because it's such a good
Right.
segment.
Well, I mean, typically, and because I'm really into stand-up comedy, and so typically the way it works is that a stand-up comedian will be working towards a special, so an hour-long special, and they typically have got these different bits that they're working on that they're going
Right.
to work into this. And so usually like they've got like different sets. So it'll be usually like 10 to 15 minutes is a set that they'll
Okay.
then
Yeah.
perform until they get that right, and then they string them together and put them into a special. And
Right.
so I'm sure he has done this many times on stage until it gets to the special. And then you kind of
Yeah.
reset and you're starting on all your new sets.
Right.
So he, so anybody who has not seen this, it is so worth looking up. John Mulaney. So, how do you spell his last name? I think it's
L
Mulaney, I want to
Yeah,
say.
that sounds right.
Um, and just type in that and Back to the Future. And certainly, if you've got a Netflix subscription, it is so worth watching because he basically
It's
explains
so funny.
how they had to pitch Back to the Future. And this is why I'm saying that the movie should not work. These
No,
are terrible premises for a movie. The premise is so
yes.
awful. Like everything about it is just terrible.
Absolutely. I know. It is the weirdest premise. The fact that you buy into it so quickly, it really speaks to the film's credit because it's true. You opened the film up with like Marty McFly going into this workshop, messing around with some things, including playing a guitar with a giant amplifier, like 2 times the size of him.
Yes.
And then he gets a phone call from this old guy. And then Marty's like, wait, what? All your clocks are wrong. I'm late for school. And then you're just like, what is going on here?
I know.
The most
Every
messed up thing. You know, there's no relationship that's set up between Marty and Doc Brown. And yet you're just like, all right, I guess they know each other. I guess they're friends. Like,
Well, okay, this is what I'm saying. So this is terrific because looking up the way in the real history of this of how they had to pitch this, then they got turned down a lot for years. So it actually was really hard for them to get this film. And when I'm saying they, I mean Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis, who were co-writers on the film.
right.
That it took them a lot of work and a lot of studios said no. Disney was like, the dude almost has sex with his mom. No, that's not a Disney movie. Get out of here. and then
Yeah.
and then other studios were like,
But don't worry, he gets interrupted before he does. Like,
right. Right. But it's okay. And it's like, wait, what's the relationship that he has with this old creepy scientist dude who this disgraced nuclear physicist that like this teenager has got this. So apparently this wasn't working in the I think it was in the script that it wasn't working. The relationship between Marty and Doc Brown, and then they wrote in this scene of Marty goes there with the massive amplifier and then like, plays guitar, gets blown away, and then like apparently that resolved it. Then it's like, oh, we get it. They're good friends. And I'm like, how does that do it? That you're pointing to this and you're saying, what? And I'm saying that was their solution to how they know each other.
Oh my goodness.
What kind of a solution is that?
It really is just, I guess they're friends then.
Yeah, that's all that it is. I guess they're friends.
Like without that scene, then I could actually absolutely see that being, a much worse film, because then you just have like, Doc Brown being like, okay, I want you to meet me in the parking lot of this mall at 2 in the morning.
Right.
And he just goes there.
Right. It's like To Catch a Predator, right? That this is like a really weird like it could come across as so weird. And even the thing with Marty and his mom could come across as so weird, but for whatever reason, it's puzzling to me how it actually works.
Yeah.
But I think that you're right, though, that without that scene with the amplifier, then it wouldn't make sense. And I think the reason why it does actually help is that you realize why Marty wants to hang out with Doc Brown. Because it's like, he's got really cool stuff.
That's true. Yeah, there's all kinds of fun, inventions sitting around. And who doesn't want to have, an inventor?
Right.
Like,
An inventor friend who's just got like these crazy things that you get to like just tinker with and play around with, and it's like that
especially
amplifier.
because he goes there and Doc Brown isn't there, so he's
Right.
really allowed to just mess around. Like,
Right.
clearly Doc Brown is not like, no, you can't go in there unless I'm there. Like,
Yeah.
he calls him and he's perfectly fine. He's like, oh, I'm
He
so
knows
glad you're
where
there.
he
I wanted
is.
to talk to you.
Right. Yeah. And so it's such a it's in such a strange way then that actually works. But it shouldn't work, but it does.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to see, more of that awkward relationship between an old inventor and a kid, just watch Rick and Morty, which is very much inspired by Back to the
Yeah, I
Future.
haven't actually watched any of that, but that's an interesting.
Oh, I mean, it's literally, that was the inspiration for the show.
That's amazing.
Yeah. But yeah, so there are so many things in this film that should not work. You are absolutely right.
Right.
But it is like it's the combination of everything, really. The cast, the directing, the writers, like absolutely everything works so well together. And speaking of cast, I'm sure that you found this, that oh my goodness, Marty McFly was originally supposed to be played by another actor.
Yeah.
So not Michael J. Fox, but somebody else, and they even did some work, like some scenes with this other actor, who I'm blanking on the name of the other actor at the moment.
I think it was Stultz or something like that.
Okay. But anyway, so they still have like some of that footage, but they just, it wasn't working for whatever reason. And I think that to have started production on something and be like, yep, this is our lead character, and however many weeks into filming, they're just like, this isn't working. If we keep doing it like this film is gonna bomb.
Yeah.
We need to have a different actor. I don't want to say a better actor, but just a more appropriate actor for one reason or another.
Yeah.
Which was also difficult on Michael J. Fox, who was working on
Family Ties.
Yeah, Family Ties. So he was like going back and forth between the two different studios, sleeping like in the car on the way between between filming. And That's just incredible because they knew like they wanted him and they couldn't make it work and then managed to get it to work.
Absolutely. But it plays really well into his performance in Back to the Future because he should be frantic and disoriented and fairly sleep deprived. Like
That's
he should
true.
not look okay. And
That's
at the
very
same
true.
time, like Michael J. Fox is just such a charismatic actor. Like it is
Hmm.
just he's similar to Tom Hanks in that it's got to be really hard to dislike him. Like I
Yeah,
haven't heard anybody ever say, "Oh, I see Michael J. Fox," and I go, "Ugh, I don't like that guy." Like
right.
he's just so likable.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. Michael J. Fox is absolutely incredible in everything I've seen him in.
Yeah,
And I mean, like he's like the voice of Stuart Little, literally
right.
like a lovable little character.
Yeah. Well, he's got a distinct voice, and it's a great voice.
Mhm.
Uh, but I did want to like before we get into too much of the actual films. Like I said, I just wanted to finish off by this whole thing of how they actually brought it into production. So
Yeah.
they wrote it and it was like 5 years before it ended up getting released and they kind of were bouncing around from one studio to another trying to pitch this trying and then I think they had the script that like they were selling the option on it but they weren't getting it into production and things like that so they had a good relationship. Zemeckis and Bob Gale had a good relationship with Steven Spielberg, but they had done two films for him that like for I think Amblin Entertainment that just did not do well. And so
Mm.
then they did Romancing the Stone. I don't know if you've seen Romancing the Stone.
No, I haven't.
It's really good. It's a great adventure movie, and it's sort of a romantic comedy. It's got Michael
Okay.
Douglas and Kathleen Turner and Danny DeVito's in it as well.
Okay.
And it's
Definitely sounds like my kind of film then.
Yeah, no, it's really, really good. They did
Cool.
that, and then there's a sequel to that called Jewel of the Nile. Both of those are really fun. They're good adventure films in the jungle, and it's like there's a treasure involved, and it's like
Yeah, like
yeah,
yeah.
they,
Interesting.
yeah, they're fun movies. So then they did Romancing the Stone, which did really, really well. So then they're like, all right, now we can make Back to the Future because Zemeckis said if I make a third movie for Spielberg's production company and it's a flop, then I'm never going to make a movie again because I'm
Mm.
just going to get known as no one else in town will produce any of my films except for Spielberg. And then I clearly shouldn't even be making films if I do three in a row that all fail. But because Romancing the Stone did so well, then he felt confident that he could then go and do Back to the Future. So
Okay.
the interesting thing to me about this is that when you look at Back to the Future and you're like, how the hell did this movie get made? Then it's like it actually took a lot of work to get it
Yeah.
produced. And then I thought this was interesting too. So agreeing to produce Back to the Future, Spielberg set the project up at his production company, Amblin Entertainment, with Kathleen Kennedy and Frank Marshall joining Spielberg as executive producers on the film. I don't know if you knew that.
I did not. Yeah. That is
Yeah,
really
that's
interesting.
Yeah, to me, that's a really interesting connection. Kathleen Kennedy was one of the executive producers on Back to the Future. And so, for all of the criticism that gets thrown her way, and, whether you think some of it's all of it or some of it is fair or unfair, you got to look at that and say, oh, okay. I mean, she wasn't
Mhm.
the only executive producer on that, but that's interesting. And I'd be curious to see that.
Yeah.
Because I think part of to me what seems interesting about that is that not only I don't know how much of a role she played as executive producer,
Mhm.
but with her obviously being head of Lucasfilms, right? That is her role. She's
Yeah.
what CEO of Lucasfilms, or I don't know what the title
Yeah,
is.
I don't know. I don't know what you would call it, because I guess it's not really its
President.
own company anymore. Yeah, maybe president.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then she's and the criticism of her has a lot to do with I guess gender politics within Star Wars,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, she wears like, like the Force is female t-shirts, and she talks about how women should be playing a bigger role and all of that. But you look at Back to the Future, and Back to the Future, nobody criticizes for the role that women are playing, but women are playing fairly significant roles.
Yeah, I mean, oh my goodness, I'm blanking on the name of the actress who plays Marty's mother. Um, uh,
Right.
but she does a phenomenal job throughout.
Yeah.
Um, like, and I mean, you can, throw all the praise on her for any number of roles, but she really really does a great job in those three films, playing different roles
Yeah.
in each.
Yeah. It's
Whether it's Leah
Leah
Thompson,
Thompson. Yeah.
that's right, yeah. But yeah, because she plays the young
Yep.
um, woman, and then she plays the mother figure,
Yep.
and then she also is in Back to the Future Part 3. Then she plays a different kind of mother figure in the
Yeah.
Old West.
Yeah. She
Um,
does.
yeah, and I mean that honestly can be said about any of these actors in these films, but yeah, Leah Thompson is iconic, absolutely iconic in Back to the Future.
Right. Yeah. And so then just another really interesting thing about this is initially, so this all, I'm just getting this from the Wikipedia page, but I'm presuming that this is accurate because Wikipedia generally is like, this is not such a controversial topic that I think you have to be too critical of it. Um,
Right.
but in an early script, the time machine was a refrigerator, and Marty would need the power of an atomic explosion at the Nevada test site to return home. Zemeckis was concerned that children would accidentally lock themselves in refrigerators and felt it was more useful if the time machine were mobile. So then they come up with, the DeLorean, right? But then check this out, because this was like mind blowing to me. Um, so hold that thought in your head.
Okay.
And then uh, the original climax was deemed too expensive by Universal executives and was simplified by keeping the plot within Hill Valley and incorporating the clock tower sequence, because I think maybe they were still planning to do something with like nuclear power in the Nevada desert.
Right. That makes sense.
So
Huh.
then Spielberg used the omitted refrigerator and Nevada nuclear site elements in his 2008 film Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. So that
Yeah.
terrible, terrible sequence in Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, where he literally survives a nuclear explosion by being in a lead refrigerator,
Oh.
that was supposed to be Back to the Future.
Uh,
If it was a bad idea in 1985, why was it a good idea in 2008?
23 years later. You know what? Maybe it's a good idea, actually.
Spielberg's like, that idea's too good to waste. It's like, it's not too good. It's a terrible idea.
I mean, George Lucas had a lot to do with, writing Kingdom of the Crystal Skull as well, but um,
I'm just saying, it could be
yeah.
wrong, it could be inaccurate, but according to Wikipedia, it was Spielberg who was like, hey, remember that thing?
Yes. Well, I mean, Spielberg has, gotten a lot of heat recently, so.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it is true that like this is a clear example. At least the first film, it's a clear example of how rewriting is so important to
Yeah.
filmmaking. Like
To filmmaking. Yes.
you have to get that script perfect
Yep.
before you can even get approval to start
Yeah.
working on it.
Yeah.
And so many things can go wrong along the way
Yeah.
if
Even
especially
in
if you
production,
yeah,
that you
yeah,
still have to be flexible.
that's true. Yeah. So I mean it really is, the fact that they were limited by budget, I think works really well. I mean, if you go to, like the Universal lot, then like they at least until recently, I think it was burned down recently, and they might have been rebuilding it. But Hill Valley is there as a set. Like
That's
you
awesome.
could go there and see it, and
Right.
it's like that square,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
the central square is it is iconic, and it's the fact that it all stays within that town with the iconic clock tower. And I mean, I'm saying iconic so many times, but it really is like,
No, it is. The thing is that the movie, and this is, it might seem like a strange connection, but it's going back to the podcast that we did about Christopher Nolan Batman films. That I'm saying that The Dark Knight, I think, is the best one because it's entirely centered in Gotham. Aside from like that one sequence where he goes to, I think, China or Taiwan or something like that to go and get the guy, but otherwise, it's really you're just in Gotham. And then the other ones, they're much more global films, which I don't think works for Batman. And in this, it's that you are so absorbed into the town of Hill Valley that you're immersed in it. That it's a very immersive film. That you believe it's a very convincing set. It's a very convincing location. Um,
yes, and especially like the fact that it's a small town works so well with the recurring characters and the
yes,
family lines that you see
yes,
throughout, whether
yeah,
you're talking about from 1885 or 2015. Like,
right.
you believe that, yeah, those families are just sticking around
Oh,
in this
I mean,
one community.
you're absolutely right. And the thing is that like so we grew up in Toronto and then I moved. So this is for people who are watching. I moved out of the city and then I moved into I've been working in small communities for the last like 11 years or so or 12 years, something like that. And I mean, literally, you are in the town that has got the name, so I don't necessarily, because I don't know if people in the town would want me to say this, but let's say it's, um, I don't know. I'm trying to think of like what a good name would be, but like Stoneman Town, like Stonemanville, then it's like
Mhm.
you meet tons of Stonemans. Literally,
Right.
they are
Yeah.
descendants. And it's like and because as a teacher, then like I'll have my attendance list and then I'll be going through it and you see the last names and you're driving around town and almost every single street name, I've got a kid with that last name. I'm not kidding. It's really incredible about small communities that is not made up. And
Right.
it's not
Yeah.
that people haven't moved out, but that there's enough of them who have stayed that when you're driving around in a small community and you see all the different street names with those last names, you will find all of their descendants in town. It actually
Right.
holds up. So like watching Back to the Future, I'm like, that's actually true. Like you go back to the 1800s, you're going to see people with that family name. You go to the
Yeah.
1950s, you're going to see people with that family name, and then like in the 2000s, you will.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, even even our family history, like we're not terribly we weren't terribly centralized in one particular city. Certainly like the region of Southern Ontario. But in Scarborough, then there's a road called Harris Farm Gate, which is actually where like our ancestors like lived. Ancestors like, yeah, like they had the farm there, the Harris Farm, and
Huh.
that's the road that you took to get there. Yeah, yeah, Dad told me about that, and I was like,
Oh yeah,
oh
I didn't know that.
really? And he's
Yeah.
like, yeah, this is where our farm used to be. And I was like, oh, it's not a farm anymore.
Right. Right. Exactly.
um but yeah, so it's so true, and it's so absolutely perfect that that was brought out by restrictions on budget, because uh I, I mean, people are always talking about like, oh, like whatever, you've got the script, like just whatever it takes, like however much money it takes to shoot that script. And it's like, well, no, there do need to be budgetary restrictions, and it's not always a bad thing. It
No.
can help a film, like
With
100%.
every good M. Night Shyamalan film, proof.
Right. Yeah. Or even like the ending of Deadpool, they make a huge joke about it because, Deadpool like packs all these guns into a bag and drives to do the final confrontation and then leaves the bag of guns in the trunk of the taxi as it drives away. And he realizes, and he just kind of swears and he's like, ah! And they had to do that because they're like, we can't afford to do all this.
Right. Right.
This action sequence.
That's right.
But it's a fun joke in the context of the film, and they make it work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that can be so effective. So, all right. We've basically introduced a lot of these ideas of the films shouldn't work, but they do work. So how are they working? And let me explain part of what I mean by that. There is so much, and I think that there is so much bad film criticism online, on YouTube, on blogs, and all of that. People who really just say things with a lot of conviction, and they don't seem to know what on earth they're talking about. And so one of the ideas out there that, like, to quote Stephen Colbert, it's got an air of truthiness, right? So
yes.
The idea of truthiness is that a film has to fit within a genre. That if it's not fitting within a genre, then that's incompetent filmmaking. Right. Well, what is this movie? Is this a comedy, or is this a science fiction film, or is this a romantic comedy? And it's like, pick one. And I'm like, no, you idiot. You don't have to pick one. You can actually blend genres. And so then, like, they point to, like, if they had to consider a film like Back to the Future, then I think it would confound their argument that a film has to have a consistent genre, or even a consistent tone, right? Which is confusing, because, like, that's, to me, I think that's the tone is, I have tried to teach tone. I do not know how many times in my life. And I feel like I do a pretty good job, better than most teachers, when it comes to the concept of tone and understanding what it is. But it is, I would dare say, an impossible concept to teach. That it is something that you have to intuit, that you
Absolutely.
can't, like,
it's a feeling, it's an
it
emotion
is, right,
about the scene or sequence or film or whatever.
Yes.
Like it's not something that you can be like, well, clearly this is that tone. Like, it's, there aren't, I would say that there's not the proper vocabulary to
Right.
describe tones.
It defies language. That language is just too restrictive to actually accurately explain and describe what tone is, because tone is a feeling. It's the evocation, right? It evokes something in you. And so then you say, well, how did it evoke that thing in me? And you can kind of get into this where you're getting into deconstructionism, of, like, trying to deconstruct the film into its constituent elements. But that still doesn't actually tell you how it's doing it. It just says, here's all of these different things. It's like saying, like, what makes a cookie good? And it's like butter, flour, a little bit of salt, like baking soda. And it's like, that's not what makes it good, though. It's not those individual elements. And it has to do with heat. It has to do with, do you know what I mean? That it's like, to ultimately get to that good thing, it's a little bit of a mystery.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
that's why before, like I was saying, like it works so well with everything that's combined.
Yes.
You're missing that lead actor of Michael J. Fox, the movie doesn't work.
Yeah.
You're missing, Steven Spielberg influencing them. The movie doesn't work. You're missing, that budgetary thing. The movie doesn't work. Like,
the soundtrack as well.
The soundtrack, absolutely.
Soundtrack is spectacular.
Everything in that film works so well together in ways that if any one of them was missing or misplaced, then it wouldn't work.
Right.
It really wouldn't. Like, and it's crazy to think about that. To think that, because people, like we're not the only ones who hold Back to the Future in a high regard. It's,
No.
but it's crazy to think that like it couldn't like that it could have not been what it is.
Yeah.
Because it really is just part of standardized film discourse where you talk about the time travel movie, people are going to bring up Back to the Future as one of the first, I'd say at least one of the first three examples
Mm.
that they mention, like maybe like the time machine,
Yeah.
but Back to the Future is up there. It might not be the first thing that people mention, but it's certainly there. Like,
Yeah. Well, and that's again, this is part of my point that why it defies logic that these movies work because it is hard to find any good time travel movie.
yeah,
I,
absolutely.
time travel usually fails. It's usually a failed attempt to do a good time travel story. So it's like, because here are all the things that I think, these are all the reasons why I think the film shouldn't work. For one thing, you've got all these different genres that are all blended together. You've got it's action, it's adventure, it's science fiction, there's comedy, there's a little bit of romance.
Hmm.
Um, I'm trying to think of other elements to it, but you're certainly dealing
There's
with
yeah, like there's drama,
there's drama in there, yeah.
suspense, there's
Suspense, yep.
like really
It's a bit of a mystery too, of like a mystery in the sense of maybe mystery is not the right word, but I guess it's suspense of how do we actually get you back? Like because it's
right.
problem solving throughout the film of oh no, he's stuck there because you don't have the technology in 1955 that you have in 1985, and you're now relying on a doctor in 1955 to be able to do something that took him 30 years to figure out how to do. So now
Yes.
he's trying to work backwards from the technology that he produced 30 years in the future to then figure out how he actually got there. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I honestly, I just want to take a moment to applaud Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale on
Yeah.
the script that they were able to come up with. Like, even just the ideas that they were able to come up with.
Yeah.
This premise is absolutely ridiculous.
It's so ridiculous. And then you get this whole weird thing of like Marty goes back and then his mom is in love with him, like she's got a crush on him, and then he has to help his dad get together with his mom, and he's dealing with the previous generation of his bully, with
Yeah.
Biff. um it's such a, and like I say, as a, so most people would say, well, if you've got all of that, it's not going to work. You need to pick one. Time travel usually doesn't work. And then the thing that seems to make it work, as far as I can tell, is the tone. It's the tone of
Mhm.
the film, and or of all three films. And they are, the films all feel like they have real stakes that,
Yes.
but there's still the lighthearted comedy in there without actually removing the stakes. And
Mhm.
so there's real tension, there's real suspense, but the comedy is authentic, it's genuine, it's coming out of natural moments in the film.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. And I do think that it's a comedic film, and yet there aren't a lot of jokes.
Yes,
It's
that's good. That's what I was going to say, is that what's so interesting to me about the comedy in the film is that none of this stuff is funny for the characters, but it's
right.
hilarious for us as an audience, right?
Yeah,
That
but even still, like I don't find that there are a lot of laugh out loud moments in the films. Like I'm watching them and I'm like, yeah, it's funny, but I'm not necessarily like, ah, that was a great joke,
you're
because it
right.
doesn't feel like it's a joke. It feels like it's just, like with with Doc being like, you know, heavy. Why is everything heavy? Like, is there
Right.
some sort of problem with the Earth's gravitational field in the future?
Right.
You don't even have a moment to really like stop and laugh. You're just like,
No.
that was a funny thing to have been said, but we're moving on with all these other problems that are going on.
Right, exactly. Well, and because you kind of smile and nod along
Yes.
with most of the film. You're just kind of smiling and nodding that it's very enjoyable, it's very satisfying in that sense. Um, and for the characters, like I mean, some of the funniest elements of the films, I think, are Doc Brown's or Christopher Lloyd's facial reactions to things not
Yes.
going right. And it's like for
Absolutely.
him, it's not funny. And I feel like I'm quite sure of this because I've been told this by many people that I have a very expressive face, and so, and so when things go wrong, some of the faces I make, I'm sure, are hilarious to people who are not invested in what I'm invested in, right? But that,
Right.
like, whether he's like trying to do like the model of the car, I think that's one of the like the best scenes ever. And then the whole thing catches on fire, and he's just like, oh!
Yeah, just the way that his mouth drops open. You can't even see his eyes because they're behind the goggles. It's just,
It's so good. Or when he's on the clock tower and just like his screaming and
yeah. Or even when he's freaking out about, what did I just say? Play that back. 1.21 gigawatts.
right. He's doing all of this and it is so he's amped up to 11 for most of the film, but it never feels like slapstick. It feels like, no, this is just a quirky, weird character, but who is very believable.
Absolutely. He's not doing it in like it really is very, very much like you believe that he feels like the universe is going to collapse in and on itself.
Yes.
Because he does. Like the
for
character
for him
does.
the stakes are so real, and then
Yeah.
for you, and you do get that, but because this is one description of comedy. I by no means is this the all-encompassing definition of comedy, but comedy is tragedy happening to somebody else, right? And
Yes.
it's if it's happening to you, it's not funny, but if it's happening to somebody else, then it can be funny. Like when you see somebody, like, especially if you're not actually there, like you're looking through a window and you see somebody slip and fall on the ice, especially how they fall can be very funny.
That's
But when
true.
you slip and fall on the ice, as you did not that long ago, it is not funny. And in fact, it like you can feel mortified if you're doing it in public where other people are watching. And it's like the
Absolutely.
shame and embarrassment. You can feel the heat going to your face immediately. Like, oh no, that was probably funny for everyone else, but boy, that hurt. And that was not funny for me.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's one of the things that Christopher Lloyd really nails is that his character doesn't care how he appears to other people. You know,
Right.
he's
Right.
so quirky. Like he doesn't care. He's just like doing. He is freaking out about things, and he is not mortified by other
Oh,
people thinking that he's.
right. And
um,
all of the sequences too with Marty and his mother. Like if this were happening to you, like it would be like a barf show. It would just be you know what I mean? Like
yeah,
it was just like any person would be like, blah, this is disgusting. What's going on? But I can't actually tell her why this is such a problem because
right.
then I'm going to ruin the space-time continuum and everything I know and love will disappear. And so I have to somehow, you know what I mean? But you're watching Marty do this and you're just like, whoo, how's Marty going to get out of this one?
Absolutely. Yeah, the tension for like the stakes for him are just as real
Oh yeah.
as for Doc Brown. Like you're looking at both of them and you're like, yeah, these are the worst possible places for either of these characters to be.
Right.
Like with Michael J. Fox, like I don't know, even just learning like his mother has parked before. He's
Oh
like,
yeah.
what? And then like she pulls out a cigarette and he's like, what are you doing? Like
Right. Right.
he's freaking out. He's like, this is not my mom, but it is my mom. But I don't understand what's going on. I need to
Right.
get out of here, but I can't because if I do, then my dad won't show up to interrupt us and end up falling in love with her. Like he has to be in this impossibly difficult situation.
Exactly. And ordinarily, like that kind of comedy usually doesn't work for me, like where it's just really, really awkward, right? But it doesn't even feel all that awkward. This is what I'm trying to say about the tone. The
Mhm.
tone of these films is because there's genuine suspense. So you're invested in this. It's not just like, oh, there's an easy solution out of this. And I think that's the problem with most awkward comedy, like where you're getting comedic situations from awkward situations. It's like, if you would just tell them what's going on, if you just told the truth, but you're
Right.
worried about like, but it's like this one, you're like, he has no choice. Like throughout the
Yeah.
entire franchise, you just see them get into these situations and you're just like, there is no way out other than what he's doing, other than this very difficult, uncomfortable thing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Doc Brown in Back to the Future 3, when he fell in love with this woman named Clara, and he's like, but I can't do anything about it. She existed, 100 years ago. And then he does finally decide to tell her, like, I'm from the future. I came here in a time machine, and she doesn't believe him. And it's devastating for him. Like, there's no way that anybody would believe anything that any of these characters are saying. Even Marty, when he's trying to explain it to Doc
Mm-hmm.
in 1955, then
Mm-hmm.
he's like, I'm telling you, I'm from the future. I'm from 1985. And Doc Brown is like, oh, really? Who's the president? Ronald Reagan, the TV
That's right.
actor.
That's right.
It's like there's no way to properly get through this.
Right. And that's one of like where a lot of the comedy comes from because it ends up being not exactly, but for many characters, it's dramatic irony that we know more than the characters in the film. But we
Yes.
don't know more than Marty. But so that's why I'm saying it's not exactly like a pure form of dramatic irony where we know more than every character, but we know more than almost every character. And there's a lot of silliness involved in that where you're like it is kind of crazy that Ronald Reagan became president because he legitimately was an actor and there was no indication of that. And it's like but in 1985 if you went into 2019 and you're like who's the president? Donald Trump. What? That guy? Right? Or certainly if it was like the late 90s or early 2000s, I guess, like when he was doing The Apprentice, that it's like the reality TV star, like real estate mogul, that guy whose catchphrase is "you're fired." Like, so you look at this and you're like, it is funny the things that become real that no one in the
Yes.
past would ever believe could be possible.
Absolutely. And that I think is uh, uh, one of the best things transitioning a little bit into Back to the Future 2.
Yeah.
It it is so well done, trying to like how do you show what the future is going to look like 30 years from now? It's like nobody knows what's going to happen.
Right.
They don't show cell phones or anything like that. They instead, show expansions on what was currently the most important thing. Technology wasn't, like it was on the rise, but nobody knew what was going to happen with it, right? Like
Yeah.
in the mid 80s, I guess by then it's like 1990, but still like
Hmm.
nobody had any idea about, the internet or whatever. So you still have like a fax machine
Yeah.
and you have like the TV where you're watching 6 channels at once. You have windows that are actually just screens, which is actually a thing.
Yeah.
um, you have like the voice activated lights. You have all these things that either have or haven't come to be
Yeah.
by 2015 or even today, and you're looking at it and you're like, well, I believe that all those things that they thought could happen would have happened, like flying cars. Sure, yeah, I could totally buy that. Like, could they be a reality in another 30 years? Most people are going to say, oh, yeah, they'll definitely be around. They might be, they might not.
Hmm.
And we still don't know uh,
Right.
what's going to happen at that point. It does such a good job of, you know, anticipating what would be. Fashion was huge. Not to say that fashion isn't huge now, but it's huge in a different way now than it was in the 80s.
Hmm.
Where, you had, uh, as I mentioned, like before the podcast started, like the self-lacing Nike shoes, which are now a thing because of Back to the Future, which is
Right.
really crazy. Um, but uh, but yeah, like you've got like the self-lacing shoes, the jacket that automatically fits your size, and has built-in dryers so that if it gets wet, then it dries itself.
Yep.
You've got hoverboards instead of skateboards. Like they're because skateboarding was such a huge thing in the 80s.
Yep.
It's not so much a thing anymore. And because of that, then nobody cares about, I mean, people still want to see a hoverboard, but the bigger concept that became uh, wanted was, a motorized thing, something on wheels
Hmm.
with, you saw that with like the Segway, so that
Yeah.
you could hop on it and roll around. And they're like, okay, well, how do we make that even better? So now you have hoverboards,
Right.
sort of like the little boards with like, just the two wheels, and you adjust it just with like adjusting the weight that you put on each side of it. It's it's fascinating to see that, so many things that they predicted uh, didn't come true, but totally could have if
Yeah.
trends had continued in the same direction.
Exactly. Yeah, the futurist aspect of it is really, really interesting. Star Trek also was doing really interesting things, and I've heard that before, that a lot of engineers have looked at science fiction technology and then they get inspired by that's where a lot of these ideas are coming from, that it's coming from, like, when, and to me, like, that's one of the, to me, I like science fiction. I've even, written some science fiction, and I think that's one of the cool things about it, is that the importance of the arts. It's that artists, while it might seem like what artists are doing is just a completely, um, you know, imaginary feat, that it has real world implications eventually. That when you have
Absolutely.
creative people who are coming up with very, very, uh, you know, coming up with concepts and designs and theories that they cannot engineer themselves, but they're coming up with the origin of this, then engineers from there can take that from the creative people and then do the very practical elements of it. And not to say that engineers are not creative, because they are, certainly in problem solving,
Hmm.
but they can then get inspired by that, and that it has real world implications. Like, as best I understand, I mean, like, cell phones have a lot to do with tricorders from Star Trek. That
Right.
you have a
Yeah.
lot of people in Silicon Valley saying, well, you watch Star Trek and you're like, well, look, their tricorder can do all of these different things. And I remember watching like The Next Generation when I was a kid, and I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. You could have like one little thing that can do that, that you can scan for things, that you can do all these different functions and programs. I'm like, how can that one little, and like, but you look at it and their tricorders are so much bigger than cell phones.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, it really is, I mean, it's an old adage at this point, but life imitates art, art imitates life.
Yeah.
Like it goes back and forth, and the way
Yeah.
that they interact with each other is fascinating to study. And Back to the Future is no exception, where
Yeah.
you look at the fact that they had an actor who became president, and then they looked at, okay, well, what's going to happen in 30 years? You're going to have this, you know, this jerk who only cares about money. If he's given the option of you know, here's how you're going to win, billions of dollars, then he becomes the owner of the entire city, the
Yep.
entire town. Um, and yet he only cares about one thing, about getting Lorraine, the
Yeah.
girl.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it, it, it's it's so well done. I personally I I mean, we've gone for the bell rang, but I want to say, like, I think my favorite out of the three um, is probably Back to the Future Part Two. Um, just because I mean it doesn't there are plot holes in in Back to the Future, and I'm not denying those. But I think that the depiction of the future is brilliant. The stakes of, having to go back to 1955 in order to stop what they had caused to happen
Yes.
to their present
Yep.
is so compelling because you're
Yes.
like, everything would have been fine if they didn't travel through time, which
Exactly.
is, I mean, that's also what happens in the first film, but it's, again, like a different level because Marty directly influenced the events of the first one by, pushing his father out of the way of the car.
Yep.
But in two, it's just, we brought a time machine to the future. And then everything got ruined.
Right. It is one of it's so interesting to me because I think it is one of the best examples of a worthy sequel.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is that the sequel should be, I think, ideally, a sequel is taking the same tone, typically, right? That you're
Mhm.
continuing on with the same tone, but you've now got bigger stakes, but they are a natural product of the first film.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you get is that you don't have a repeat of the first film, which is not good. Like that's a bad sequel, or where the tone is just totally different. And it's like, well, that usually, like, the sequels like that are generally not very good. But this is uh, taking that same tone, which you've got the same creative team behind it, right?
Hmm.
And for the most part, the same cast. And
Yeah.
then you're saying, but it's a natural follow through of what happens from that first film, and there's a lot more going on. And Marty is now in this very difficult position of he's now in the future, so that's even more disorienting than being in the past. But then he ultimately goes to the past in order to fix all of this stuff. And when you're watching it from, like, to me, there are so few good time travel movies.
Hmm.
And usually it's because they end up becoming too convoluted, right?
Yes.
And this is a franchise, a trilogy that becomes complex without becoming convoluted, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. You you don't have the issue of like some other time travel movies where uh oh well, now there are multiple time machines. Nope. There's
Right.
still like it's not them versus another time traveler. It's not yeah, it does get more complex without getting more convoluted. It doesn't get totally bogged down in the rules of time travel. It sticks by those
Exactly.
same initial rules, of like, yeah, you can alter the present by going to the past, you can alter the future, and like yeah, it just it works so well.
It works
um
because unlike many time travel movies, and it's like, well, we don't know, like they become so convoluted because it ends up being this whole thing of, well, we don't, there are no clear objectives. It's like, well, we want to go back to the
right.
past or we want to go to the future, but it's like, but any one little thing we do could alter everything. But then within Back to the Future, the internal logic of these films is that there are very clear objectives. As long as this happens, that's going to be okay. And when things are going
Hmm.
wrong because you can see in the picture, like in the photograph, you can see that you're disappearing. You got to fix this, right? That you can see
Yes.
that you're not correcting things the way they need to be corrected. And that's such a clever way of achieving suspense and stakes within the film, and then also
Absolutely.
knowing, being reassured that things are going okay. Like in the first film, when he's disappearing and he's disappearing. And then, like, his dad then goes, and I think, what is he? He punches Biff on the dance floor and then he takes Lorraine. Is that it?
No, I think it was some other bully because he had already punched
Oh,
Biff in
okay.
the parking lot.
Right.
Or not like another bully, but like somebody like stepped in and like
Yeah.
took Lorraine, and it was, another moment of his dad having to come to terms with like, no, I need to stand up and, not protect her, but I need to stand up for what I want, which
Exactly. To be
was
assertive,
yeah,
to
yeah,
assert himself. And
yeah,
then Marty comes back, right? Because he's disappearing, he can't play
yeah.
guitar, and it's like going all sideways, and you're like, oh no, oh no, oh no. And then, like, he just like literally comes back like that. And then he
Yeah.
like hits the right chord, and then the people in the band are like, okay, you're back. Like, you got back on track. And it's like, and we're all like, oh, he's back. But the band within the film are like, oh good, you're back. And
Yeah.
but Marty can still have fun. He can still play Johnny Be Good, which is ultimately where you get Johnny Be Good from, which is so fun. Like, that element of the
Yeah.
film, when he does that, like
Absolutely.
where, like, like Chuck Berry is like one of their cousins or something like that, and it's like, hey
Yeah.
Chuck, get to listen to this. But it's such
Yeah.
so then you're like, oh, like, see, because other time travel movies would then get into this whole thing of, oh, so Johnny Be Good couldn't exist if Marty didn't go back in time, so he had to go back in time because
Right.
Chuck Berry had to then hear that. But how did Marty then hear it? Right? That it
Yeah.
becomes a paradox. And this is the problem to
Right.
me with most time travel stories, is that there are these natural paradoxes that come up within them. That
Yeah.
Back to the Future, like, I this is why I'm saying it's so staggering that these films work, because they shouldn't work. It's
Hmm.
how did they get around that in a way that you don't, as a viewer, say, wait, you just created a paradox and you haven't resolved it, and now I'm
Right.
lost, or I'm confused, or I'm frustrated, or I feel like you're not respecting my intelligence. That it's like they've set up rules, they
Yeah.
they set up objectives even more than rules. Like, there are the rules that Marty has to abide by, but then there are objectives of definite things that he has to accomplish. And
Yes.
then
The other
you
things don't matter as much. Where it's
exactly.
like, there might be a few glitches here and there, and you see the results of the changes that were made
Yeah,
when Marty goes back to his present, at the end of the first film, and he's like, wait a second, like. What are you talking about? Like, oh, I don't have my own car. I do? What?
right.
Like, what do you
Things
mean you
become
wrote a whole
better.
series of books? What do you mean? Like, it's a different present, but it. I mean, it does kind of bring up all these philosophical, questions, or whatever, like scientific questions about what is, you know, uh, like what is life, like what determines what's going to happen in life, there are a lot of elements of examining uh, the way that the space-time continuum functions by looking at the films, but it itself doesn't focus on those.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. And that's where most time travel plots go wrong, is that
Yeah.
it becomes too interested in those questions, and it's it's impossible to you've painted yourself into a corner the second you start trying to resolve time travel paradoxes. That if you
Mhm.
become too focused on that question, because literally you've got physicists who try to understand like this, and it's like, and you still have paradoxes, even
Right.
getting into a really complex examination of what would happen with causation,
Mhm.
within time travel. It's just, that's too, you can't simplify that in a narrative. I mean, like, this as a screenwriter, that you have to simplify things so much, and then to take
Absolutely.
something that's maybe the most complex thing that we can imagine, which is time travel, and then somehow you're trying to resolve that in a film. The second you try to resolve it, you're going to have a bad movie.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I know. The second film is the one that comes closest to that, which is when they go back to the present from the future, and it's a different present than the one that they left.
Yeah.
And then, Marty's like, well, can't we just go back to our present? And Doc is like, oh, well, it doesn't exist anymore because now we went this way and we're off
Mm.
on a different, on a different timeline.
Yes.
That's the closest that it comes to explaining any of this. And
Right.
that's enough, because it does present what the issue is without saying like, oh, okay, well then we need to, completely undo this. Oh, let's, go back to the future and stop ourselves from going like it doesn't get bogged down in that. It's like we need to go back to the root cause of what happened.
Yep. I know
and
it
and and
it's
solve that.
it's so economically addresses those issues, and then like I say, it gives you very clear objectives, right?
Mhm.
That I mean, there's a lot of movies that deal with time travel that just don't do a good job of it. I mean, we talked before about X-Men, and I was saying how my only criticism of the X-Men films, maybe not my only, but one of my criticisms is that the plots end up being really convoluted. Uh,
Yeah.
and but with this, then it somehow works where you can take a complex concept like time travel, but you have simplified it enough that still respects the viewer's intelligence that children can watch the movie and be satisfied, but adults can watch the movie and be satisfied, right?
Absolutely.
And I
Yeah.
think that's one of the fun things about like the tone of Back to the Future is that they're very much the tone is a similar tone that you get in most Pixar films, where it's
Yeah.
it works on one level with the suspense and the stakes for children, but there are some things that adults are going to catch that kids are not going to catch, but they're not essential to enjoy the movie.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I know that there are so many things in the films that I didn't get as a kid that I
Right.
didn't understand. But yeah, you're just following along with this teenager who goes back in time, stops his parents from meeting, so then has to somehow solve that.
Yep, that's the objective. And then he
Yeah,
has to somehow figure out a way to get back to his own present, where
right.
he's got to get the fuel for the time machine. You've got a couple different objectives that have to get accomplished, and then you get a fair bit of
Kind of one for each character as well, one for Marty, one for Doc. So
exactly. Yeah, they're
yeah.
both doing that. It's like basically your A and your B storyline. And
Hmm.
then within that, then you get this fish out of water comedy that comes from Marty being there in
Yeah.
the 1950s. And then we as the viewer get to vicariously experience that of like traveling back to the 1950s. And it's like, oh, yeah, that would be a really funny thing. Like if you
Right.
went back, uh, I mean, all of the little issues that would come up and all of the stuff that we take for granted, like I'm saying we as in the 1980s, that we took for granted in the 1980s, that they don't take for granted in the 1950s. And then getting into
Yeah.
like 2015, the stuff that we take for granted there that people in the 1980s would not take for granted. That you get this fish out of water comedy, but
Yeah.
it's never Marty's trying to be funny, but it ends up being funny for us.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And even when he goes back to 1885,
Yeah.
um, yeah, one of the things that I love about the trilogy is that it does all that, and it's I I don't know. It shows how there are, these echoes in time, right? These same events that are not the exact same events occurring over and over, but like the whole, expression of those who fail history are doomed to repeat it. Like you get
Yeah.
like some of those types of things where it's like, well, yeah, it's not that, like, oh, this character is going to keep doing the exact same thing every single time, and they're
Right.
always going to be, failing at it or whatever. No, it's yeah, you're going to have similar things that keep happening over and over again between generations. You know, like you see, uh, like Marty's kid is very much acting like Marty in a lot of ways. You know, somewhat reckless, not really knowing where he's going to be, but he's also acting like his dad, where he's not willing to stand up to the bully and whatever, where he's a bit
Yeah,
of a pushover.
yeah,
Um, and just, you know, like a lot of like those familial things, and you're like, well, is that genetic or is it, you know,
right.
like whatever? Like it it doesn't spend, you know, a lot of time on any of those concepts. It's again something where you can dissect these films for decades, which
Yeah,
people have literally
yeah,
done
yeah,
and will continue to do. Um, but the films themselves aren't about, okay, you know, what's encoded into our DNA? How much is nurture versus nature? How much is, you know, it's not about that, even though it features those things.
exactly. And that to me, and that's why I was saying that I think there's so much bad film criticism out there where it says, well, what's this film about? Right?
Mhm.
They say that they're like, well, you know, is it about this or is it about this? And then like it's to me, it's like it's very frustrating when I hear that, when I hear people who are trying to review movies or take a critical lens to a film, and then if it seems like there are multiple themes or concepts that are being introduced, then they automatically then dismiss that and then just say, well, no, you can do one thing or maybe two things. But it's like, well, no, it's ultimately about the end product. And it's so fascinating that these films are able to do so many things at once while never doing any one thing too much.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's it is a brilliant trilogy. And I mean, it really is one of my favorite trilogies of all time. And and I say that not in terms of it's my favorite series of three films, but it is a trilogy.
It
You
is.
know,
It is.
whether or not they started out thinking of a trilogy, I don't think that they did. And yet they still made it into a trilogy by, you know, part two and part three working together and it feeling like a very well-rounded story overall. You know, you very much have Marty, who has been struggling for all three films with being called a chicken and
Yeah.
with not, you know, you know, with never being able to turn down a challenge once he's called a chicken,
Yeah.
coming to terms with that in the third film. And you see that not only has he grown through his journey of traveling through time, so it's not something that, you know, like he wouldn't have grown that way if he didn't travel through time. So the films have like a real genuine result, even if there are no other changes.
Yeah.
But then it has, you know, the note that said that he was fired erased. And Jennifer, his girlfriend, asked Doc Brown, she says, what does it mean? Why did it erase? And Doc says, your future hasn't been written yet.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah, you basically are saying we went to one possible future,
Yep.
but because of you going to that future, it adjusted how you are going to live your life, which means that things are going to turn out differently, or maybe they'll turn out, you know, the same.
Exactly. It's that it's presenting on a pretty interesting level. It's presenting the concept of you know, free will versus determinism, right? And
Hmm.
it's definitely situating itself within the free will camp while also um, allowing for causation. That there
Right.
is going to be causation, that things from the past do cause things to happen in the future, but there is always free will because some time travel stories like H.G. Wells' The Time Machine
Mhm.
does show this, or even the butterfly effect. I don't know if you've seen that.
No, I haven't.
Oh, that's a really, really good time travel movie. Like it
Okay.
really is. Uh, but it's more horror.
Mm,
Not exactly horror. It's like a sci-fi horror hybrid, but it's
okay.
well worth watching in terms of like good time travel movies. But many time travel movies, they get into determinism, where it's saying that no, whatever was supposed to happen will happen. Even if you try to fix it, then it's going to then self-correct and you'll end up with that same result anyway. And I
Right.
think that's the frustrating thing about films like that. I mean, the butterfly effect does that for good effect. Like I'm saying, you can
Hmm.
do a good deterministic time
Right.
travel movie. But what is Back to the Future doing? Well, it's allowing for free will, but also having causation in there.
Absolutely. And I mean, they're for the simplest example, at least in the trilogy, then, just look at the end of the first film where, like, Marty's parents didn't meet the same way that they did originally, but they still met and it still
Exactly.
ended up with the same result.
Exactly.
It's
Causation and free will.
yes, yeah, it's yeah, absolutely. It's not determined how you'll get there or even necessarily what, will happen.
Yep.
There is some element of free will, and that is like something that personally I believe, and it's um eh, eh, now that I'm saying that, it reminds me of Forrest Gump, which
Mm.
deals with the exact same topic, where, that film ends with, Forrest saying, like, and I only bring this up because it was also done by Robert Zemeckis.
Yes, I was gonna say that to people who are watching. That absolutely, that's another Robert Zemeckis film, and one
Yeah,
that he won Best Director for.
right. Yeah, but Forrest asks, or he says, like, you know, I don't know whether, I forget which way it is. Which way was it? Whether Mamo's right or or Bubba, I think. I think
Yeah.
it's those two. Anyway, one of them, says like, "Oh, we're just like free floating on a breeze.
Yeah.
Who knows what's going to happen?" Or the other one who says like, "No, like we've got a very clear, purpose in life that we're going to do this exact thing." And then
Mhm.
he says, "But I think maybe it's both."
Yeah.
And like him coming to that, to that realization is so satisfying. Like I'm literally getting chills right now
Yeah, me
just
too.
thinking about that moment because I love it so much. It's so beautiful.
And
And yeah, Back to the Future does the same thing. It
it is.
focuses on that.
It's allowing for both to exist, and it's like Forrest Gump is doing such an interesting thing with that because especially like the introductory scene and then the ending scene, it acts as a almost a frame to the film. It's not like it's not exactly a frame narrative, but it is acting as a frame where you begin and you end in the same place. And it's that you've got the feather and
Mhm.
then you've got his shoes. And I've heard this said before, and like I wish I came up with this theory for it or this analysis, but it really works. Forrest is his symbol are the shoes. They're grounded. He's so grounded. He's so down to earth and he's not theoretical. He's not caught up in abstraction or big philosophical things, which is such a virtue, right? That
Right.
he knows what's important. But Jenny is the feather. She's
Mm.
floating around and she's up here, right? She's
Yeah.
um I'm trying to think of what a good word would be for that. Um,
Almost ethereal.
ethereal, yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
That she's ethereal. That and Forrest is very corporeal, and
Mhm.
that you see that because especially at the end of the film, right? Then it's like, then the feather kind of like floats away. That it starts at the film and it ends up at his shoes. And it's like, there's Jenny and Jenny's way that she navigates through the world, that she's always kind of
Right.
floating around from one place to another, but he's so grounded. He's always there and he's always Forrest. And she doesn't quite know who she is, but then she comes alongside him. And then at the end of the film, after she passes away, then it's like, then the feather goes away and he's okay with that, right? That he's still got his feet on the ground. And it's like, yeah, but she's now gone, but she's gone to like a much better place and she's floating away. That you get both of those things in the film,
Mhm.
like as these two symbols. And Back to the Future is doing a similar thing where it's looking at this idea of not determinism, but causation, while at the same time saying, but there's free will too. And you don't like, and that's what's great about it is that on one level, when you're talking about time travel, you've got Zemeckis and Gale who are saying you can have a little bit of both, but you can also, within a genre element, you can have multiple genres get combined together. You can
Yes.
have all of these different elements in the film get combined together, and that we don't need to be reductive and simplistic in the way where we make films or tell stories, but there's a way to do it where you can introduce all of these different elements without getting without contradicting yourself, without getting too caught up in one at the expense of others. So you can actually bring them all together. Uh, it, but but how they do that, the how is, to me, I feel like I could study these films, like the screenplays, for a really long time and still struggle to figure out how they're working.
Yes, absolutely. I know. I love all three of the Back to the Future films independently and as a trilogy. They're so well written. And again, I know that there are plot holes. I know that there are things that
Yeah.
don't necessarily make sense, but I don't care.
But that's not the point. Anybody who does
Yeah,
that, like, they
it's
legitimately do not understand the point of stories. I mean, like, and a really, really simple thing, like, and this would be, I would love to get like all these people who bring this up of like all these things wrong with it, and here's this plot hole and that plot hole. I just want to grab them by the shoulders and just say, have you never in your entire life done something that was so stupid, and then after the fact, somebody asked you, why did you do that? And you say, I don't know. Like,
yes.
we all, as individuals, as human beings, we occasionally do things that we don't even understand why we do it. So when people say, what's the
Absolutely.
character motivation? It's like, do you know what your own motivation is for every single thing you do in life? No. Sometimes you do things that are puzzling even to yourself. You look back and you go, why did I do that thing? And so
Yes.
it's fine if a film does that. That doesn't mean that it's a weakness. If anything, that's actually a strength of a film where you've
Yeah.
got elements of that where you say that was a really strange thing for a character to do, but I still can believe the fact that they did it.
Right. I mean the chief plot hole that does still like irk me just a little bit is that in Back to the Future Part 2, oddly enough, my favorite of the three, um, then Biff takes the time machine, goes back to 1955, and gives his younger self the
Almanac.
yes, the almanac. Thank you. Then he travels back to 2015 to drop off the time machine. But that 2015 should no longer exist because of all the
Yeah,
changes that happen.
absolutely. Because no matter, like, even though for Biff from the future it's only been a few seconds, ultimately there's still whatever, like 60 years in between.
Yeah,
So it's like, yeah, it only took you a second to travel, but that's been 60 years for Biff from the past to have changed everything.
right.
Or
Yeah.
even if it was 30 years in the future, whatever it ends up being, right? That
Yeah, I think it is 60 years. But yeah, because then like Doc Brown specifically brings that up. Because Marty is like, well, why can't we just go to the future and stop me from buying the almanac? And then Doc says, we can't because that future no longer exists. He's like,
yeah.
wait, so then how did Biff get back? That's the only, plot hole that like does irk me.
Yeah.
But when you're dealing with time travel, there is no perfect solution in my mind.
No,
You're
like
always going to run
physicists
into
I think would point to this, that like
yeah.
that there are, well, as far as I understand, believe me, I am not like a temporal physicist, who's like examining like time and physics and the space-time continuum and the
Yeah.
possibility of time travel. Like I don't know, but I imagine that there are legitimately paradoxes that we cannot resolve. That it just
Yeah.
seems like, well, time travel would be impossible because how can these two things coexist?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, we've talked about it before. There's an element of suspension of disbelief. There has
Yes.
to be.
Yes. And it
And
either achieves that or it doesn't achieve that. And
right.
so I'm saying that the films achieve it. They
Yes.
they function, they are successful, and some people who point to this, like because that's where I get frustrated when people point to plot holes, because then they will say, you know, well, you liked the movie. Let me try to spoil it for you by pointing out how I'm so clever that I can show you why you shouldn't have liked that. And it's like, but I did like it. So I don't know
Yeah.
what you're trying to do here, right?
Yeah. I mean, I still like, going back and watching the films time and time again, even though I know that there is that plot hole there. It doesn't affect my overall enjoyment of the films.
Right. Right, exactly. Um, so we should probably wrap this up, but I'll say what you brought up before is really, to me, it's really interesting. It's that, especially the first film, Back to the Future, shows how important it is for a screenwriter to go back and continue to rework the script, because they literally, Zemeckis and Gale had the idea for a long time, but it was like years. I don't know, at least six, because they were pitching it, and I think they sold the option in like 1980, but it didn't even get fully, like it wasn't released until 85. I don't know when it went into production, if it was 84
Mm,
or if it was 85. But you're talking, and like the amount of changes that screenplay must have gone through, it just seems incredible to me. And how do you even do that? Like, I'm really curious about that. If I could get, somebody like Zemeckis or Gale, uh, obviously, like this, like would I don't realistically think this would happen, but if I could actually like sit them down, and let's say on the podcast, ask them pointed questions, I would really want to know, how do you know when a producer is correct? When they say,
right.
no, you've got to change that. Or some other screenwriter who comes in to punch up the script or whatever, who says, we've got to change that element. Or an actor says, what if we change this? How do you know when they're right and when they're wrong? Because
Right.
Back to the Future, the screenplay, based off of the ultimate product in the film, it's a film that, like I say, I do not think should work, but
Mhm.
it does work. And so I'm so curious, because I think this thing could have gone wrong in so many different ways. And it's like it's like a minefield. You're entering this thing of like the Oedipal aspect of the film, the
Mhm.
mother and Marty, the time travel, blending of genres, his relationship with Doc Brown, all of those things. And it's like everything about that is a minefield. And they somehow figured out a way to get all the way through that without setting off any mines in the first one. You can say a little bit in the second one with that little plot hole,
Yeah.
that there's a tiny little poof there. But aside from that, these films hold up so well to scrutiny
Yes.
that, but so many other writers and directors have tried even just a couple of those elements and failed. So
Yeah.
how did they get there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and in addition to having to, struggle with all these big concepts, they were still able to get in all these little elements. Like every single film has a tannin, coated in manure.
Honestly, my favorite part of Back to the Future. Like, it's one of those like recurring gags where I'm just like, how's it going to happen in this one? Because you just know it's going to happen, right? It's such a
Right.
fun joke, because especially because like the Tannen guy in like the Back to the Future Part 3, he doesn't know that his family has got a future legacy that's going to come back in this one. That it's like somehow you're going to get like covered in manure. I just know it.
Yeah.
But you don't know it yet. So it's that fun dramatic irony.
Yeah. Like Doc Brown apologizing for the crudity of the model both times.
That's right.
It's like,
That's
I'm
right.
sorry about Marty for the crudity of the model.
That's right. That's
It's
right.
like dude, we have bigger issues than just the model. Like,
That's right. I know that's one of the best. That's so terrific. One of my favorite ones is the way Marty is always using like famous people's names. He calls himself, like whether it's Calvin Klein or Clint Eastwood. You know what I mean? I like
yeah.
those elements.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and the fact that, originally then like the gorge that the train goes over was originally known as Clayton Ravine, named after Clara Clayton, but because she
Right.
didn't go over the edge, then it ended up being named Eastman.
Right. Right.
It's oh, that's so fantastic because they don't say it, they don't direct you to it. Well, I
Exactly.
mean, they direct you to
Yeah.
it, but not they have it just on a sign
Yeah.
by the river or by the ravine, and you're just supposed to see it.
Yeah.
And even like the Twin Pines Mall where they are in the first film, and Doc Brown brings this up in the opening of that film, where he says like, "Oh, this whole area used to be owned by, that farmer. He had this crazy idea of breeding trees," which
Right.
is the Twin Pines. Then Marty goes back in time, so he ends up on the farm and drives away and knocks over one of the trees. So then at the end of the film, when you go back there, it's called the Lone Pine Mall. And you're like, what?
Right. Oh man, it's been a while since I've seen them. That's amazing. And see, that's one of those things where I'm saying for adults, and these films holding up to scrutiny, but for adults, like a Pixar film, there are little things like that adults are going to pick up on that kids are not necessarily going to pick up on, and that's fine. You don't
Yeah.
need to have all those things to still have fun, but the fact that they're in there is really fun.
Yes, yeah. And again, like the fact that, like they were able to get like to focus on those little details and to
Yeah.
put these jokes that are going to go over the heads of, if people only saw the film once, 95% of the audience is never going to notice,
Right.
at least some of these things. They're going to completely miss them, but
Yeah.
still they felt like putting them in there.
Exactly.
Yeah, those details are so yeah, absolutely props to Bob and Bob,
Yes, that's right. Bob and Bob.
which just reminds me of Office Space. Oh, hi, Bob. Bob.
Bob. Exactly.
Maybe that's why he goes by Robert Zemeckis.
Right. Yeah, because his writing partner legitimately is Bob Gale. I looked and like on almost everything, they co-write these movies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like almost every Robert Zemeckis film that you can think of, Bob Gale is there as his writing partner.
Cool.
Yeah.
Uh, oh man, and we definitely I think we're definitely going to have a Robert Zemeckis episode
Yeah.
in the future, probably near future.
Yeah.
Because he has done so many amazing films.
Absolutely.
I mean, well, honestly, one of the ones that I want to talk about the most is Who Framed Roger Rabbit,
Mm,
which is another Christopher Lloyd film.
right.
So, yeah. Um, but yeah, in terms of Back to the Future, as we said, these films could be dissected for decades and
Yeah.
have been and will be. There's no way that we can talk about everything in them.
No. But I think that we did, justice to the films in the discussion. I think that we brought up some really interesting points with this. Uh, and for anybody who's watching this, like I would appreciate you commenting and thinking through some of these ideas of, how exactly why are these films working when they probably shouldn't be working, right?
Yeah.
Because legitimately, like I say, going back to the John Mulaney routine, then the pitch meeting, and they had trouble, like as I was pointing out, they had trouble getting studios to go alongside with this. So it's such a great case study in it defies, it's like the exception that proves the rule, right?
Right.
But
Yeah.
to me, like that's every time people say that a film has to do this or has to do that or has to do that, then I'm like, no, this shows that there are not actually rules within. the industry and a lot of critics want you to think that there are, because they're uncomfortable with mystery. They're uncomfortable, like they feel like it's going to make them look stupid. And I'm not, as this podcast can attest, I am not afraid to look stupid, or at the very least, I'm not afraid to point out where I'm puzzled over something, because I remain puzzled over how well they work. Aside from the fact that I'm saying, I think it's the tone. The tone is what seems to make these films work, but the films are doing all kinds of things that a screenplay is not supposed to do. And they're doing all of those things, and it works. So to me, that says, well, it's not so much that bad movies are doing these things. It's that they're bad for other reasons, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I do feel like this film is, or these films are one of a kind, where they struck gold with with
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
But part of that is because studios are so unwilling, for very legitimate reasons,
Yeah.
to, they're unwilling uh, to greenlight these scripts that break rules, and because they
Yes.
don't know how they're going to do at the box office, which
Yeah.
it is show business.
Yeah.
It is a business, and yeah. But I mean, like, kind of the way that I approach writing is like, basically all the stories that there are to tell have already been told. But if you can combine different stories together, you're going to create something brand new. And that, I feel, is what Back to the Future does. It takes, okay, well, there's already been this time travel story, and okay, well, there's already been the Oedipus, or Oedipus,
Yeah.
story. There's already been, this, that, and the other. There's already been comedies. There's already been whatever. If you put them all together, you get something completely new and
You do.
original.
And it's also what Roger Ebert says, because I don't really like that idea that there are no new stories, which is very much like a Jungian psychological concept, or like a Joseph Campbell concept.
I just mean in terms of like the concepts of genre and everything, where
No.
it's.
I get that. I think it's just that, anyway, I have issues with that theory. But what Roger Ebert says is, like, in part, you are right that if you combine things together, if you get this blend, then you get something totally different. Not just a
Mhm.
blend, but it becomes something else entirely. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
but the way Roger Ebert describes films, and he says it's not what your movie's about, it's how it's about it, right?
Right.
Which really has to do with, in part, narrative point of view, but tone more than anything else. Because I've
Hmm.
pointed this out before on the podcast, but James Bond and Austin Powers are essentially the same plot, right? On
Yeah.
a superficial level, but they have completely different effects, because the tone, it's how you're telling the story, how
Yeah.
it's about this story, completely changes it. And so then when people will say, like, there are no new stories, then it's like, well, no, Austin Powers is a different story, even though it's the same story, but it's a different
Right.
story because of how it's being told, and it's the attitude towards it, which is the definition of tone, the attitude towards a topic, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's one definition of it, which I think is like a definition that's not very helpful.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Yeah, I may have phrased, my approach to writing a little, um, uh, triggeringly,
No,
but
I don't disagree with what you're saying. I think that you are right. And I think that you have to keep that in mind, because you have to keep that in mind because so many executives believe
mhm.
that, right?
Yes,
And so then you have to be aware of what is the consensus. Even if you don't agree with the consensus, you should still know what the consensus is. And that's,
right.
for most people, then they do think that there's no new stories. And then I'm like, my whole thing, this will just be a tiny little aside here, and then we'll wrap this up. It's that, yeah, on it just so it shows how superficial you are if you believe that, because on a superficial level, then there are no new stories. that
Right.
if you reduce them to the most superficial elements of the film, then of course there are no new stories.
Right.
Then it's like, I mean, like I guarantee you, I can say like, oh well, does your film feature human beings? Yeah. We've heard that story before. Like,
Yes,
you see how
absolutely.
stupid this is? It's the most idiotic thing ever. Like, when you
Yeah.
reduce it to the most superficial level, like, so then it's like, oh, it's a man on the run story. Oh, that's been told before. And it's like, well, yeah, if you reduce it, that's what it's about. But
Yeah.
you
Man
take away.
meets woman. Oh, that's been done before. We can't do that.
That's right. That's right. It's just so silly like if you follow that through though, it would if that was actually true. Cuz see, like we believe it but we don't believe it. If that was actually true, then every single screenwriter can sue every new screenwriter for producing a
Yeah,
script and say, "Oh, that's intellectual property theft. That
right.
you've stolen my intellectual property." But we know that they're different. So it's like,
Yeah.
wait a minute, you dummies. You just said that there are no new stories, except for the fact that intellectual property law indicates that they are new and they are original and they are different because you might have individual elements that are similar to other things, but the entire complete product ends up being something completely new.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that's really what I was
Mhm.
trying to get to. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and you're right. And that's what I'm saying. I don't think that you said it poorly. I think that like you have to
Okay.
keep that in mind. Like cuz you
Yeah.
have to know that that's like if you're pitching it to an executive, if you're pitching it
Mm.
to anybody whether it's a manager or a talent agent, then you got to know a lot of these people believe that rule. And so
Yes.
then you have to be able to say, oh, but here's how it's not the same story. Here's the blend that I'm doing. Here's what makes it unique because they want that. They want it to be as reductive and simplistic as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know that there are, some there are some, forms or whatever where if you're submitting a screenplay to a competition or to an agent or whatever, then there's actually like a line that says like films that are similar to this.
Yeah, your
Um,
comp titles.
yeah, and you're just like, what? I don't want to say that it's like anything else. It's
I
because
know.
it's not. It's
I've had that issue every single time I've pitched a book to a literary agent. That issue has come up every single time. Then and I usually don't even have comp titles, comparison titles on mine. And when I do, then like I know they're not good. And then people are
right.
like it's just that stupid logic of like, oh, well, if you don't know what book is similar to yours or what books are similar to yours, it's because you haven't read enough. And it's like, or I'm actually doing something different.
Yeah.
Can you handle that idea that maybe I'm doing something different? Like,
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. So again, all props to Bob and Bob.
Bob and Bob. Oh yeah.
No, Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale, absolutely wonderful screenwriters, wonderful director, and they got, the perfect cast eventually,
Perfect cast,
the perfect
Michael J.
script
Fox,
eventually.
Christopher Lloyd, Leah Thompson, Crispin Glover, who plays his dad, who is so terrific.
That's
You
right.
know,
Yeah.
like Crispin Glover is such a fun actor to watch.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, like seeing him play, I mean, I mentioned before, like Leah Thompson plays like different roles, even if she's playing the same character, like by name, she's playing different roles
Yeah,
as that
yeah,
character.
yeah.
And yeah, it's the same thing with Crispin Glover and, you know,
I mean, his laugh alone, his you know how he does that
yeah.
and he just points and he the laugh alone to me I'm like give him all the awards right there, just give it to him.
Yeah, and then seeing the change like at the end of the film, and you're just like, wait, this is the same guy? Like,
Right,
there are
yeah,
legitimately moments where I forget that it's the
me
same
too,
actor
I
playing
know.
these different things. Like,
Yes, yes,
um,
absolutely.
yeah, so perfect cast again, eventually.
Yeah,
Um,
soundtrack,
perfect soundtrack,
set
perfect,
design.
yeah. Oh my goodness. Like every time sorry, going back to soundtrack, every time I hear the song Mr. Sandman,
Yeah.
I think of Back to the Future.
You're Marty in the 1950s, right? Yeah. And I mean, and certainly special effects, which we didn't really talk about, but and I don't want to get into it because I do want to wrap this up. But especially I was looking this up, Back to the Future 2, then that was ILM
Okay.
who
Yeah.
did, and like they got tons and tons of praise for that. So I can never remember. Is it Industrial Light and Magic? Is that it?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, which is George Lucas's special effects company.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, you've got, all the flying cars and everything. You've got
Yeah, which
even
look amazing.
something, yeah, even something as simple as the flame effects on the ground, though, where the tires were, like
Oh
it's
yeah,
it so clearly, evokes what you're supposed to
yeah.
what you're
Isn't that
supposed
awesome?
to,
Yeah,
to see there. You're like, okay, yeah, that's where the car was driving. Like,
yeah,
and it's so perfect.
yeah, yeah. I mean, exactly. The special effects on it, like they hold up, you
Absolutely.
which is incredible. Yeah, it's
Even
just
like the Pizza Hut thing, they like put the tiny little disc
oh
of pizza
yeah,
into the hydrator.
right,
Hydrate level 4, please. And then it
right.
comes out as a full pizza. You're like, what the?
Exactly. Exactly. To me, that makes a lot more sense than like, in Star Trek with the replicators.
Right.
I
Yeah.
still understand what replicators are doing, but yeah, the hydrator makes more sense to me.
Yes, absolutely. Oh man. But yes, we should definitely wrap this up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed
And
that.
again, comment in the comment section
Yeah.
for any of your thoughts on all of
Yeah.
this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right.
Great.
Bye.
Bye.
Ignore the bell, people. We're gonna keep going. We're still ignoring it. Don't worry. I don't know what that. I think that's the fire drill. All right. We're gonna go home. Yeah. All right. We're done.